Let's say our La'asok B'divrei Torah blessing together. Baruch Ta Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Tivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. Okay. So, a review that on one foot, Midrash is taking biblical texts and interpreting them. A Midrash can be a sentence, it can be an entire novel or entire movie. Classical Midrashim are found in classical collections and the Talmud, and there's an extended one in the Haggadah. That would be the one about my father was a wandering Aramean, where they take every phrase, I believe, of that, either possibly every verse, but every part of that text and expound on it for at least a page, depending on which Haggadah you have. So that would be an example of Midrash that you might encounter. However, anybody can make a Midrash today as long as it doesn't contradict the plain meaning of the biblical text. So Midrash started from the discussions that happened amongst the rabbis after the Talmud was destroyed. The rabbis up until the year 200 or so were known as the Tanaim. Their Midrashim became Tanaitic Midrash. The rabbis who came after them, starting after around the year 200 CE or so, were known as the Amoraim, and therefore their Midrashim became known as Amoraitic Midrash. And Midrashim made today are contemporary or modern Midrash. And in between, there's medieval Midrash and all sorts of other such things. All right, types of Midrash that there are. Halachic Midrash seeks to explain the deeper meaning of the text. Aggadic Midrash is holy fan fiction, where it explains the missing parts of the story. Classical Midrashic texts were written between 200 and 1200 CE. And some of these include the Mechilta, the Sifra, and the Sifrei. These are Halachic Midrash and the Tanchuma. Aggadic Midrash would be Midrash Rabbah, with things like Genesis Rabbah, or Bereshit Rabbah, Exodus Rabbah, Shemot Rabbah. So each of the books of the Torah, 5 books, and the 5 scrolls, the 5 Megillot, Esther, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Eicha, and Ecclesiastes / Kohelet. Note that I'll send this to you so you can digest it again, because I know I'm going quickly. So one of the things that I didn't know last week, but I investigated based off of a question from this group, is why did certain Midrashim make it into the collections, whereas others were left out? One of my friends is a professor of rabbinics, or I guess he's now retired, was a professor of rabbinics at the University of Illinois. He is cited in textbooks about Midrash. So I reached out to him. His name is Professor Gary Porton. And according to him, who knows much more than I do, we don't know, because we weren't around back then. We don't know what material the people who compiled and edited the collections had. So therefore, we don't know what they left out. They didn't leave any notes from their meetings, so we don't know why they chose what they chose. But we do know that the collection happened over a period of time, that the manuscripts that we have are much later than the original collections. And there are different versions, at least until the printing press in the 1400s. So there's a lot that we don't know. Questions up until now, before we dive into Halachic Midrash? Okay, seeing none. Let's move on. So, halachic midrash. This is midrash that is commenting on biblical stories, but it's not stories themselves. The redaction of this is dated to after the Mishnah was finished, so after 200 CE, but before the Talmuds were finished, so before 400 CE. And halachic midrash in the why would anybody care about this department is that it is a step in halacha between what's in the Torah and what's in the Talmud. So we're going to look at a few examples of this now. So one example that we looked at last week, and therefore I'll just refer to it briefly, is in the Torah, as the Israelites are leaving Egypt, it says in Exodus, when in the time to come, or in Hebrew, machar, tomorrow, a child of yours asks, saying, what does this mean? You shall reply, it was with a mighty hand that God brought us out from Egypt, from the house of bondage. Fairly straightforward. Then the Mechilta picks up on the word machar, tomorrow, and notes that sometimes that's like in 24 hours, and sometimes that's much later. And it brings some verses to support why it could be either one. And then one of the verses it brings is another verse that's very similar to this one from Exodus about when your child asks, but this child gets a different answer. And so they go on to say there are 4 sons, the wise son, wicked son, simple son, and one who does not know how to ask. And thus begins our journey into the 4 children. So this is the first step, no, second step, I guess, after the Bible, into what becomes the 4 children in the Haggadah today. All right. Another example of halachic midrash affecting us today. So it says that this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you, referring to the calendar. This verse is set as the Israelites are getting ready to leave Egypt, but before the 10th plague. So, since we have the time this week, if you look at this verse, what questions do you have? Because Midrash answers questions, or explores questions at least.
So was this intended to start the beginning of a new year, the day of the actual Exodus beginning? When they first left Egypt? Is that why it's put it just before the 10th plague? Or is there some other possible reason that I'm not seeing?
Okay. Good question. What other questions?
Is it Rosh Chodesh? What?
All right. So, does this have to do with Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month? Okay. Good. And it does in fact say Rosh. Go ahead.
Aren't there other first months cited in other places?
Okay. Are there other first months elsewhere? Okay. Other questions?
I guess you could ask why.
Yeah. Why? Okay. So let's see what the Mechilta does with this. All right. So the Mechilta, which is the book of halachic midrash, commenting on on Exodus picks up on the phrase, it is the first. And it asks, what is the intent of this? It is written in Deuteronomy, in the Torah reading that we read on Shmini Atzeret, the last day of Passover, and the last day of Shavuot. Observe the month of Aviv and offer the Pesach to the Lord your God. So it says, so it's saying from that verse, we see that Passover has to be in Aviv, which is spring, and Aviv has to be for Passover. So Aviv, the month of spring, has to be in its proper time, which would be logically spring. How do we make that happen? We should intercalate Adar, so that Aviv falls out in its proper time. Intercalate means stick something into the calendar. In this case, a month. So if the rabbis decided that they would stick another Adar in next to the first Adar, and then Aviv, the month of spring, which we would now call Nisan, did not fall out in its proper time, then I might think that they should intercalate the new month of Nisan. And Rabbi Ishmael says, if you say this, you make Nisan twice. But the Torah has said it is the first one to you and not two. So because of the verse in Exodus, where it says this month, which equals the month where Passover is, and we know from Deuteronomy that Passover equals the month of Aviv, spring, because in Exodus it says this one is the first of months, it can't be that we double it, because then that verse wouldn't make as much sense. Rabbi Nathan says, observe the month of Aviv, which he interprets to mean observe the month which is closest to Aviv, presumably for the purposes of sticking in an extra month so that spring falls in the right time. And at this point, I should take a moment to explain why we are worried about sticking months in the first place. The solar calendar is how many days?
$365 or 6.
All right, 365, occasionally 366. The Jewish calendar is based off of months. And a month, if you stick in an extra O, you get the word month.
28 days.
The lunar calendar.
It's a lunar calendar. So 12,
28
12
days?
12 months of Jewish months are either 29 or 30 days. And the Lev Shalom Siddur actually lays out very nicely which one is which. The 12 lunar months gets you 354 days. That's 11 days shorter than a solar year. So that means that every holiday moves up by 11 days. This happens in the Muslim calendar as well. So Ramadan, the month that is particularly important to Muslims, sometimes it's in the summer, and as it moves up by 11 days, eventually gets to the winter. So sometimes Jews do a shared break fast with Muslims on Yom Kippur, and sometimes they do a shared break fast with Muslims on Tisha B'Av. And there are communities that make sure to do this whenever they can. However, because of the verse in Deuteronomy that says that Passover has to be in Aviv, has to be in the spring, if Passover keeps moving up by 11 days, eventually it will no longer be in the spring. And so we have to intercalate, we have to stick in an extra month and bump it back down so that it can start meandering up again. That's why usually Passover lines up with Easter, but because this year it's a leap year, Easter is much closer to Purim. So this is the issue. And until 568 CE, the Jewish calendar wasn't fixed. Hillel II did that. So that meant that every year they had to figure out, do we need to stick in an extra month or not? And the Mishnah talks about the signs in the crops that the rabbis consulted to see if they needed an extra. So the question that we're talking about here is, what month do we stick in? So now we go back to that. So we've gotten to the point where we've said that we're sticking in the month of Adar, which is, if Passover is in the first month, Adar is the last month. But we have not heard how many days are to be intercalated. From observe the month of Aviv, we can infer that a month of days, i.e. 30, are to be intercalated. And this follows: a month is intercalated and a year is intercalated. Just as a month with one of its days, so a year with one of its units. And we go on in even more complicated fashions for quite a while. So you're starting to see how the weeds work of Midrash Halacha. This becomes the first text to get us to the point today that affects our calendar this year about what month we stick in a leap year. Questions about this before we go on? Okay, I've either explained things super clearly or super confusingly to the point where there are no questions one way or the other.
No, very clear. It's very clever. Really. I mean, the math is not trivial.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's look at another example. Okay, so again, Exodus 13. All our examples today happen to be coming from the same set of verses right around the Exodus of Egypt. So here we say, this shall serve you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, which we get a note that this means literally between your eyes, as it says in the V'ahavta, in order that the teaching of God may be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand God freed you from Egypt. All right. What questions would you have about this verse?
I'd ask what the verse, if I had never seen this before, I'd ask what the verse before this said.
No, that's fair. I'll tell you, because if you were looking at this, if you were playing the game of Midrash, you would be looking at it in context. It follows yet another one of the source verses for the 4 children. So another one of those, when your child asks you about this day, you shall tell them that, I think with a mighty hand, God freed us from the house of bondage, or something to that effect. I'll look that up right now because it might be particularly relevant. 1 second. 13:9. Okay. And you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. All right. So maybe that's helpful, maybe that's not.
I think
What other
your
questions?
first reaction might be, huh? What do you mean? Sign on my hand and a reminder. It seems like a non sequitur and completely opaque.
Right, Solomon.
I was thinking this came approximately the place where it said something about tefillin, and you're not mentioning tefillin.
Hello?
I think this might actually be tefillin.
Yeah,
Except-
but it doesn't, that's only because we're reading it with hindsight.
But
Yeah.
I believe Torah mentions tying these upon your arm and on your forehead, and that's not what you've read. So
A question, David.
Yes.
How come it was translated a reminder on your forehead when the Hebrew says reminder between your eyes?
That's a good question.
Zikaron beinenecha. How come they translated it as on your forehead in the first place?
So it's probably a choice of the translator to make it more obvious that this is talking about tefillin, because something that is between your eyes
Is your nose. Very
it
basic.
could be your nose, or it
Basic
could be the
nose.
very bottom of your forehead.
Mhm.
It's also probably being the translator here, who in this case was not me, is probably being influenced by rabbinic interpretation of this verse, because the rabbis take this and the other 3 verses. There are a set of 4 verses throughout the Bible, well, throughout the Torah, that refer to this topic, one being in the V'ahavta, one being in the second paragraph of the Shema, V'hayim Shemoah. Both of those are in Deuteronomy. I forget what the 4th one is. But the
and
rabbis interpret what?
I'm sorry, and several Orthodox rabbis tell you it should be in the hairline and
Exactly.
at the hairline of the forehead.
Right. That is classic rabbinic interpretation of where this ought to be. So this translator was influenced by that, I would suspect.
I must admit, I've not seen anybody hold it as low as between their eyes.
No, it would get in the way. Assuming you're
I've looked
making
at this a different way, being a musician. I would always think of one of the songs by Willie Nelson, "You Were Always on My Mind," because you essentially have, you're thinking of God and about Torah.
very nice. Yeah.
I heard something about it connects to your brain. I know I'm saying this wrong, but I heard it so long ago. But that's where the eye comes from, between your eyes. Am I making sense?
Yeah. That it's I think if I'm understanding what you're saying, that in some way that placement would help it be like connected to your brain, where you would remember it more.
Right.
As it says, a remembrance between your eyes. Okay.
Hey,
Yeah.
I have
Gabriel.
a quick question, just really quickly.
Yeah.
Did any of these midrashim also specify whether or not the tefillin must be a square?
Halachic Midrash, I'm pretty sure, does not talk about that. I think that might be Talmudic. It is considered to be one of the 10 rules of tefillin that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. But I don't know that we find out about it at this point in Midrash Halacha. I'll see if I can find out where that comes in.
Thank you.
One comment I would make is that between your eyes, you actually can still see them while you're wearing them. On your forehead, you really don't see them while you're wearing them.
Ah, it's a good point. All right, so let's see what the rabbis do with this. Again, from the Mechilta, because we're commenting on Exodus. So they look at where it says, "This shall serve as a sign on your hand." They say, on your hand. This is the left hand. Now, you say this, but perhaps it's the right. Though there is no proof for this, it is intimated in Isaiah, "My hand also founded on earth, and my right hand has spanned the heavens." And in Judges, in the story of Deborah, her hand reached for the tent pin, her right for the workman's hammer, indicating that hand unqualified as the left hand. So right here, we are trying to figure out, when it says put them on your hand, which hand do you put them on? So in order to figure that out, we have to go into the Bible and see, when it talks about hand, what hand does it mean? Now, usually it's not terribly clear, but we do have two verses that help us. The first verse is from Isaiah, where it says, "My hand founded the earth, founded on earth, and my right hand spanned the heavens." So hand must be different from right hand. And again in Judges, her hand reached for the tent pin, her right for the workman's hammer. So if you think about how that must be, it's very hard to hold the tent pin and the hammer in the same hand if you're planning on hammering the pin. So therefore, that must mean that the left hand has the pin and the right hand has the hammer.
Yeah, well, depends if you're lefty or righty, or if you're
That's a different problem.
ambidextrous. Well, but I mean, I know some of my grandchildren or some of my cousins will take something right hand, and because they're left-handed, they'll hammer with the left hand.
That's true. That is true.
Good point.
Yes.
And if you're ambidextrous,
Yeah, like my son-in-law. When he does surgery, it makes no difference what side he stands on.
So we're going to find out, because they're going to talk about that, kind of. Rabbi Yonatan says in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, that that in the V'ahavta it says, "You shall tie them and you shall write them." So it says, "Ukshartam, blah, 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 uchtavtam, blah, 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 blah." So just as the writing of the mezuzah is with the right hand, so the tying of the tefillin has to happen on the left hand, because however you write is the hand that you tie with. So to the point that you guys were just raising, if you write with your left hand, you tie with your left hand because of the parallelism of the structure. So if you're tying with your right hand, you can't put tefillin on your right hand if you're tying with the right hand.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, you must be putting your tefillin on your left hand. And if you are tying with your left hand, then you put tefillin on the right hand.
as an interesting aside,
Yes.
my father, of blessed memory, would write with his left hand, but when using a hammer, he would use his right hand.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my grandsons bats lefty and throws righty.
Mm-hmm. So the question would be, for purposes of tefillin, what hand do they write with? If they naturally, and if you say, well, I could write with either one, then the way to solve this one would be to distract them, and then put a pen and a piece of paper at them and ask them to write their name, and whatever hand they pick up the pen with without thinking about it, That's the one that they tie their tefillin with onto the other hand. And then it goes on to say another verse about how the right could also be called the hand. And it's based off of Genesis, where Jacob is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, and he puts his right hand on Ephraim's head, and then Jacob gets upset because Manasseh is the older one, so he should get the right hand. And then finally, this text ends with what is the intent of saying that it should go upon your hand? And the answer is to include an amputee of the left hand that his tefillin are placed on his right arm. So, even back then, missing limbs were perhaps more common and certainly considered when thinking about these sorts of things. Now, later steps. So we see how the Mechilta is building on what it says in the Torah. The Torah says, here, put this as a sign on your hand, and later on Deuteronomy, bind it as a sign on your hand. So in the Mechilta, in the Halachic Midrash, it takes us to the next step of saying, what hand do you put it on? You put it on whatever hand you put on your left hand. And then in the Talmud, it goes on to say that you would put it, like, where on the hand do you put it? You put it on the arm, because yad could be both hand or arm. And then Maimonides, later on in the 1100s, I think, yes, says that if you're left-handed, you put it on your right arm, because that's like your left hand for right-handed people. And the Shulchan Aruch in the 1500s takes it a step further and says that you should say a blessing, and you should say the blessing before you tighten the strap on your, quote, left arm. So
One thing,
Mechilta is just one step in the halachic process between the Torah and the Talmud, and then on to today. Herb.
the one thing it doesn't say is whether the scrolls should be close to the hand or close to the heart. Down at the wrist or up by the shoulder.
Here it does not say that. Later on it does. And the idea is that it should be close to your heart. I'm trying to remember where that comes into where that gets decided on. And I don't know. So I will look it up. But you are right. That is another step that is not clarified. Okay. And there's a quote in the chat that Cindy found for us that says that the tefillin being square is in the Talmud in Menachem 35a. So thank you for finding that, Cindy. Questions about...
But they couldn't think of a reason
What?
either. But they couldn't come up with a reason, which is an invitation to Midrash, right? I mean, typically.
Right.
So it's a hook, right? Is that what they say?
Yeah. It is a
Typically.
halachic.
Yeah.
Halacha Moshe Sinai. It's
And
just
that is
something
a
we did
law.
because-
It's not like a custom.
Correct.
That's clear. Oh, okay. I see.
I think.
Yeah.
It says halacha, the Moshe Sinai. It doesn't say custom.
You could, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go on to Agadic Midrash, which is Midrash that tries to fill in gaps in biblical stories. So last time we looked at the end of Parshat Noah, the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha that we read 2 days ago, where Abram's father, we meet up, and then we find out that God talks to Abram and says, "Go forth from your house." And there is zero explanation why God chooses Abram of everybody to talk to. So then we get a quite long midrash about Abram breaking the idols, something that many people think is in the Torah, but it's only in the midrash. And all the extra details that at least I did not know about him going to his mother and asking for food, reminiscent of Rebecca making food for Jacob, which is a story we'll look at later. All right, and then we've got Midrashim in the Talmud, which a week ago I did not realize that Talmudic Midrashim are often quoting earlier Midrashim from the Tanaim, from the time of the Mishnah, from the Mechel to the Sifra and the Sifrei. So the Midrash that I brought for you in the Talmud, where it talks about the unnamed man who gathers sticks on Shabbat and is stoned, and the daughters of Tzipporah who say that their father, who has a name, Tzipporah, died of his own sin, not with Korach, but his sin is unspecified. So the rabbis say, aha, a man with a sin but no name, and a man with a name but no sin must be the same guy. And they connect those dots.
The man with no name who died in the desert, wouldn't he have died as a result of being part of the generation that came out of Egypt, and his sin was collective and because of the spies?
No, because it says he died in his own sin. So they have to find, so if you're looking for a backstory on Tzipporah, you have to find something that's unique to him, and not just that he died in the desert because the spies messed up and then everybody didn't believe in God. Like, you could say, well, everybody made their own choice to not believe in God. But it's stronger if you can come up with something specific to this guy. So
it seems so unfair. I mean, the poor guy.
Which one?
Tzipporah.
Tzipporah, yeah. So Rabbi Akiva makes the connection between these two men, and then another rabbi, after the text I brought you, rebukes Rabbi Akiva and says, if the Torah didn't want to reveal his identity, why should you dox him, basically? Why should you go revealing his identity for the future when the Torah was trying to be discreet about things?
May I ask, did anybody of the rabbis respond to say to Rabbi Akiva or in criticism that it was just illogical what he was saying, that he had that the fact that he was that these two, that if someone was that A and B both involve C doesn't mean that A and B are identical. And I just wondered if any of them, because they were familiar with kind of basic rules of logic, and he was too, but he had some reason for pinning this on Tzipporah, I guess.
Yeah. There is one other comment, I believe, in this discussion, besides the guy who's like, why are you revealing his identity? I don't remember it, but I will look that up and put it in the follow-up email.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It sounds
So, go ahead.
it sounds like the Kiva thought that there were only two people out of all those of the Israelites, only two people had sins of their own. Everybody else was pure except for those who argued against Moses.
Yeah. So he knows the pshat. He knows the literal meaning of the text. He's going to say that oh, okay, Cindy found it. Thank you. And then I'll get back to your point.
This is a whole section where they're trying to figure out unnamed people who did naughty things, right? So this is just one of them, but still, he got scolded. And then there's more text as to why Akiva came up with that plan. So anyway, I don't mean to digress.
No, thank you. So Rabbi Akiva knew the pshat, the literal meaning of the text. So he knew that there were people who died because they kvetched about wanting meat to eat. And then God said, you want meat? I'll give you meat. You're going to eat meat until it comes out of your nostrils. And then they overate and died. There were people who died because of scorpions. There were people who died because, why else? Plague. There were people who died because of earthquake associated with Korach. So everybody dies either because they really pushed one of God's buttons, or because they were just part of the general, we don't have faith in you, God, we're all going to die. Some early example of sarcasm, where there are not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out into the wilderness to die, Moses. So yes, Akiva knows that everybody's dying for a reason. And the proof of this is that two people don't die. Joshua and Caleb, they make it into the land of Israel. Joshua as the next leader, and Caleb as somebody with a lot of experience. And I think he probably has some roles in the book of Joshua, but I don't remember them right now. But everybody else dies because of a reason. Does that address your question? Or
I guess so.
okay. Okay. So what I discovered between last week and this week, once I found out that Talmudic Midrashim appear elsewhere, is that this text appears earlier in Sifrei Bamidbar. So Sifrei it's another text like the Mechilta that we saw the earlier Midrashim from comments on Exodus. Sifrei, there's a Sifrei for Numbers and a Sifrei for Deuteronomy. So this one comes from Sifrei Deuteronomy, or Numbers, Bamidbar. And the rabbis of the Talmud knew that text, so they pulled it into the Talmud, where it became much more famous, because people study the Talmud regularly, and Halach Midrash does not get so much study on a regular basis. All right. We do a quick discussion about this one. So last week we looked at the story of Cain and Abel. They each offer sacrifices. Cain's is not accepted because it's kind of meager. Abel's is accepted because he offers the best. God says to Cain, why are you distressed? If you do right, there's uplift. If you do not do right, sin couches at the door. It surges towards you, yet you can be its master. Then Cain said to his brother Abel, ... And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. So, my question for you, make up a midrash. What did Cain say to Abel? Here, I'll give you a little bit more context. There are no wrong answers as long as it doesn't contradict the story in front of you.
The part of the story it doesn't contradict is the fact that Cain killed Abel. Is that the part you're referring to? Because I often, because since you set this up last week, I've been wondering about before the sacrifices were offered and either accepted or rejected, did these two brothers like each other and talk to each other nicely, or did they hate each other before that as well?
Aha! Midrash. You get to decide. All you have to work with is the text, which is right in front of you. So, make up a midrash. You could go either way.
So Cain said to his brother Abel in verse 8, "Why are you so condescending to me? You're being a jerk." And then he killed him.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
It's awful.
That's okay. How much does a polar bear weigh? Enough to break the ice.
It's funny.
We have the world's newest midrash. Let's make up another one.
Oh.
Well, we know that he was jealous of his brother because he always brought nice, good flocks. But I think maybe he said, he felt like he was being an overachiever and showing off. So I would think he probably said, you always try to be better of me and show to God that, oh, here I am. I know I'm bringing better offerings than you. And so because of that, he was so jealous and he killed him.
All right. Very good.
Okay.
Are there any more midrashim about to be birthed into the world?
The whole thing kind of reminds me of the from the story of the musical Oklahoma, the farmer and the rancher always being at each other's throats.
Yeah. So that could be spun into Cain said to his brother Abel, "Your sheep are constantly eating my vegetables, and I'm tired of it." And then Cain sets upon his brother Abel and kills him.
And
all right.
What were the names of the farmer and the rancher in the play, Oklahoma?
Don't remember.
Maybe they were Cain and Abel.
Perhaps so.
Maybe he also said,
all right.
"At long last, we're alone. There's no one around. I'm going to carry out my threats," not realizing that God was watching.
Very nice. All right, so I'll send this to you. You can look at the traditional answers. Your answers are just as good as these. These just happen to be older. But we have now joined a long discussion about this text, which is awesome. Okay, so recognizing the time,